Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Peggy Nash, and I'm one of your hosts for today. I'm a former member of Parliament, and I'm a senior advisor to the Dean of Arts here at Ryerson University. Our discussion today, Two Women in Power, How They Made History. Now, I can tell you as a former party leadership contendant, these two women not only ran for the leadership, they won the leadership, and then they won the government of their province. So they have indeed made history. To get underway with the events this afternoon, I'm going to first call on Tuhina Chatterjee to give the land acknowledgement. Tuhina.
Thank you, Peggy. Today, we virtually meet on the traditional territory of Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee people, as well as the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of Tishwith or Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between Haudenosaunee Confederacies, Mississaugas, and the Anishinaabe Three Fire Confederacy to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes region. Subsequent indigenous nations, people, Europeans, and all newcomers like myself have been invited to this treaty in spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, the meeting place of Toronto, or as we know Toronto, is still the home to many indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have this opportunity to live, work, play, serve, and to participate in truth-telling and reconciliation on this territory. Thank you.
Thanks, Tuhina. So our program this afternoon is sponsored by the Ryerson Faculty of Arts, the Ryerson Women in the House program, and the Ryerson Democracy Forum. So I'd like to call on the Dean of the Faculty of Arts to say a few words. Here's Pam Sugerman.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pam Sugerman, Dean of the Faculty of Arts. I'm delighted to welcome you to our event today, Two Women in Power, How They Made History, sponsored by the Faculty of Arts and hosted by Toronto Star columnist and visiting practitioner Martin Reg Kahn. The Ryerson Democracy Forum series brings together notable politicians, journalists, and scholars in conversation about some of the most pressing issues of our time. The Women in the House program has partnered with the Democracy Forum to bring you this event today. Led by Peggy Nash, former Member of Parliament and current Senior Advisor to the Dean of Arts, and Dr. Tracy Rainey, a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration, Women in the House is a 4-credit course in which students who identify as women can develop a theoretical and practical understanding of women in Canadian politics. In this experience-based course, students shadow a woman MP and her staff and participate in a variety of discussions with women community leaders and activists, parliamentary journalists, and policy analysts. This innovative program reflects our faculty's firm commitment to equity in democratic engagement and democratic institutions. In the Faculty of Arts, democratic engagement is a priority. Arts is also home to the Democratic Engagement Exchange led by John Beebe, the Jaroslawski Democracy Chair held by Dr. Sanjay Ruparelia, and in collaboration with the Faculty of Community Services, the Unifor Chair in Social Justice and Democracy, currently held by Kike Roach, and the Jack Layton Chair in Social Justice held by Dr. Ken Moffat. In the near future, we'll be announcing a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Democracies, as well as a CRC in Democracy and Migration in a Decolonial setting. And last but not least, motivated by concerns about workplace democracy, we've recently launched a Youth Workers' Rights Hub. Joining us today are two women who have made history as the first woman premiers of Alberta and Ontario. Kathleen Wynne was Ontario's 25th premier, breaking ground as the first woman and openly LGBTQ+ politician in this role. And Rachel Notley was Alberta's 17th premier, reimagining politics as the first woman and New Democrat to lead Canada's 4th largest province. These two women have prioritized equity in political life and beyond, as well as the importance of bringing to the table diverse and new voices. I wish to thank them for taking time out of their busy schedules to share their experiences and their insights with our Women in the House students and to the wider community in which we live.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy Rainey. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration here at Ryerson University. And this event is being co-sponsored by the Ryerson Democracy Forum and the Women in the House program, which is a course currently being co-taught by myself and Peggy Nash. Many of you already likely know Peggy Nash and her role as a former MP. In fact, she's my former MP, and with her work with the Canadian Auto Workers Union. We're delighted to have Peggy with us at Ryerson to share her expertise of women's leadership with our students. Now in its third year, the Women in the House program is a multi-partisan program that seeks to promote women's leadership amongst the next generation of leaders. In addition to some of the activities that Dean Sugerman mentioned, this semester, students in the program have also written and delivered their own political speeches and are virtually shadowing MPs, where they're preparing gender and intersectional policy analyses briefs that they'll provide to the MPs to help inform their constituency and their parliamentary work. Today's discussion fits within the broader goals of the program as we contemplate with these two inspiring leaders what women's leadership looks like today and why we need more of it in Canada, as well as the reasons why all of our decision-making tables need to be more inclusive on the basis of gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, indigeneity, and other axes of difference. To start things off today, I'd like to introduce the moderator for our discussion, Martin Redd-Conn. Martin is a political columnist with the Toronto Star, Canada's largest daily newspaper. A foreign correspondent for 11 years, he ran the Star's Middle East and Asia bureaus, reporting for more than 40 countries, from Afghanistan to Yemen. He was also foreign editor, a world affairs columnist, and covered national politics from Ottawa. He's a visiting practitioner at Ryerson University and a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Having watched Martin moderate a few other panels here at Ryerson, I also know that he's an excellent interviewer and a keen observer of provincial politics in particular. And we're delighted that he's agreed to moderate our discussion today. So now I'll turn it over to you, Martin.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Welcome to our 13th Ryerson Democracy Forum, where we ask politicians and also students how to do our democracy differently, how to get people engaged, how to get them involved, how to keep the faith. We're co-hosting today, as you know, with Ryerson's Women in the House program and the Faculty of Arts, and a special welcome if you're watching us on the Canadian Parliamentary Channel. Thank you to CPAC for broadcasting our events. So our theme today is not just women in politics, but women in power. And our guests are two female premiers who made history and I think changed the future of our politics by opening up new possibilities that really didn't exist before. So they're going to talk about their time in power, how they won it, how they wielded power, and what they went up against along the way. Rachel Ann Notley was Alberta's 17th premier from 2015 to 2019, making history as the first woman and the first New Democrat to lead Alberta. She defeated the longest serving PC government, any government in Canada, in Canadian history. A labor lawyer, a political aide, an NDP activist, she worked for BC's Attorney General. She was first elected as MLA for Edmonton Strathcona in 2008, and she won the party leadership in 2014, a position that she still holds today. Her first exposure to politics was through her father, Grant Notley, who was the leader of the NDP in Alberta from the late 1960s to the mid 1980s. She was a rebellious adolescent by her own description, from what I can see. She once met the federal NDP leader, Ed Broadbent, and told him to his face, and I quote, "You have that same fake politician smile as my father," unquote. Now, I covered Ed Broadbent for years, so I think she was telling the truth, even if it wasn't all that tactful. But that line still makes me laugh. And at a town hall where her father was speaking in Alberta, she once challenged him, and I hope people in the audience who are Ryerson students will listen closely to this. She challenged him on student debt and complained that because of her parental income, she didn't qualify for student loans. And yet her parents, being New Democrats, I think, were so parsimonious with money that she didn't have any pocket money. So I can only hope that, Ms. Notley, you were more generous as premier than your parents were until you forced them to a draw. Kathleen O'Dea Wynne was Ontario's 25th Premier from 2013 to 2018, making history as the first woman and the first openly LGBTQ plus Premier in that role. She was also Minister of Education, a subject dear to her heart, housing, transportation, agriculture, and probably the portfolio she was most passionate about, Indigenous affairs. She won her first political victory in Richmond Hill as a high school student when she fought against a ban on girls wearing pants in class. And she has spoken out ever since about female politicians and what they have to wear. And I think she'll have something to say about this today based on past experience. She first won election as a school trustee and then as MPP for Don Valley West, and she defeated a man named John Tory in that riding. As Premier, she also won quite an unexpected and impressive majority in 2014 after years of Liberal rule when they were not expected to win that election. Another little bit of history at Ryerson. She was also a guest at our first Ryerson Democracy Forum 3 years ago, and I thank her for that. Thanks for coming back. First elected in 2003, she still serves as an MPP in the legislature, and we will come back to that question later. So lots to talk about. I'm going to kick off the questions as a warm-up act, and then we will turn it over to the audience for as much time as we have. So start thinking about the questions you have for the premiers and send us your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And Ryerson's Melissa Wong will help gather some of the questions for me to read out with your name if possible, but if you don't want to have your name attached, let us know. And if you're part of the Ryerson Women in the House program, you do have a head start because we do have some of your questions in hand. So, but keep them coming if you have some new ideas to ask about. One thing I wanted to say to set the table though, is that the two guests we have today are two of only 12 female first ministers in the history of our country out of more than 300 first ministers over time who were predominantly male. So we have a very special lineup today. Okay, I want to just start with the two premiers by asking, talk about relationships, by which I mean your own interactions with your fellow premiers. I mean, once upon a time, there were so many of you in Canada just a few years ago that I covered at First Ministers conferences or premiers conferences. Half of the premiers were in fact women in 2013 for a few months. And it was a rare moment of gender parity. And then there were none. So tell us how that changed the dynamic between provinces. How do women, I mean, this is on the minds of a lot of students, but let me try to frame it this way. How do women in politics relate differently to each other? And how constrained are you? Because it's not just about gender, it's also geography. You have provincial interests that you are elected to defend, and we can talk about that in a moment, Alberta in particular, Ontario too. So how does that interaction work in terms of geography, ideology, the ecology, provincial interests? Ms. Notley, why don't you go first? And by the way, I'm going to call them Premier, if that's okay. They can call me Martin, but I like formality. So Premier Notley, tell us how that worked for you.
Okay, I shall do. I think maybe right before I get to that, just a couple of things. First of all, hello to you and to all your viewers and students, and also hello to Kathleen. Lovely to, I assume, see you relatively quickly. And also just a quick clarification, because I think it is important to make sure we always honor women's history. I'm not actually the first female premier of Alberta.
Of course, yes.
That was Alison Redford, right? I was the first New Democrat premier of Alberta, so that was true. And I was, of course, the second female premier of the province, which is still a reasonably good feat, I guess. And the other thing, I just want to apologize to folks that are listening right now. I'm probably going to sound a little unorganized in my comments because I understood this to be starting 2 hours from now. And I had set aside some time to prepare for it. And I actually just ran in from question period and a press conference to discover this was happening now. So with that in mind, my remarks are not perhaps quite as organized as I would have thought. So I may have more to offer in answer to this question after I've listened to Kathleen and had a chance to think about it. But, I think generally speaking, certainly by the time I was elected premier, Kathleen and Christy Clark were the only two women who were elected with me. I think that our relationships were, frankly, I would argue that they had more to do with sort of our political similarities and our shared objectives. I think with such a small sample size that you have there of the premiers, that it's hard to really make a sort of observation about how I interacted differently with anybody on that basis. I think it had more to do with the things that we were trying to work on at any given time that we got together. I will say I'd always loved working with Kathleen. She was incredibly, I always used to think of Kathleen as a little bit like the Lisa Simpson of premiers, I mean, she just was just so focused on all the things that had to be done and having thought everything through and having an idea and a plan. And so being a little bit of a policy wonk myself, I really enjoyed that. I don't think that was a girl to girl thing. I just think that we just both happen to be a little policy wonky that way. In my overall time working in politics, I will say that the number of women in a political environment does change the tone. I can say that, and I'll try and say this in as apolitical and nonpartisan way as possible, but I'm still the leader of the opposition in one of the most partisan legislatures in the country, and one of the most combative, that there is a different tone when you lose a certain number of women in the House. Particularly if they are replaced by men who don't see elevating the role of women actively as an objective that is perceived as important. So there's definitely a very different approach to the way we do our work and what the tone is. I would say that generally speaking, I've found women to be more wanting to hear all the facts and more willing to hear things out rather than sort of walking in with a declared position that they then do not retreat from. It's not always the most effective means, though, of winning a political skirmish or a longer term political battle. So there's what I have to say off the top of my head in the middle of running from pillar to post. Over to Kathleen.
This is a great, let me just bridge here. This is a great demonstration of spontaneity instead of a politician having her lines, her talking points ready. So we're getting to the students and viewers, you're getting an unvarnished, unscripted Rachel Notley. So thank you for that. Kathleen Wynne, tell us your perspective about how you went into these kinds of interactions, whether gender mattered as much as geography or vice versa. And of course, we should let people in on the secret that Ms. Wynne had a background in conflict resolution and negotiations, which may be why she was always setting the table in negotiating terms and bargaining table terms. So over to you. What are your thoughts?
So first of all, hi, everybody, and thank you for being here. Rachel, it's great you're here. It's lovely to see you. I didn't know what the questions are, so, preparation's irrelevant anyway. I want to say a couple of things. I'm just going to pick up on where Rachel left off, because I think there's a perfect demonstration of some pretty fundamental differences if you look at Ontario and Alberta right now. And revelations over the last few days about the lack of collaboration, the lack of listening, the lack of a process that brought everybody in and did what Rachel said I did, but I think we did together, which was set the table, define the problem, and then take the best advice and solve the problem. And so I feel pretty passionate about that, and maybe it's personality, maybe it's partisan, but I think there's a gender analysis of that for sure. So I want to say that I had the privilege of being part of that group of premiers when there were half the premiers in the country. There were 6 of us in 2013 when I first became premier. And so I saw the difference between that table and then the table where it was just Rachel and Christy and me. And it was different. You know, at that first meeting, and Martin, you were there at Niagara on the Lake, we came to an agreement to support, for example, the call of Indigenous people for an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I can tell you categorically that, because I was at the meeting with the leadership of the Indigenous people, it was the women at the table who basically structured the discussion so that it was impossible for the men not to agree. I will just be quite upfront about it, because there were 6 of us, and you know, that's what was going to happen. And so there was a bit of shifting in the chairs of some of the men, but they had to go along with it. So that would not have happened if there hadn't been that number of women at the table. And there was there was a tacit agreement among the women, and Pauline Marois was at that table. You know, I mean, we were politically very, very different, many of us, but there was an agreement that coming to a compassionate, rational, not political decision was important. I also think, Rachel, you were part of the discussion when we were trying to come to some agreement on a Canadian energy strategy, that, we needed to talk about pipelines. And I went to Alberta specifically to talk about the importance of getting your resources to Tidewater, because that was a national issue. I didn't comment on the way, I didn't comment on the technicalities, and I tried not to interfere in Alberta politics. But it seemed to me that when one province has got an issue like that, it's a national concern. And so from my perspective, it was important that we find ways to work together as premiers. So I think that it's very clear that have a critical mass of women at the table. There's lots of research on this, and Peggy knows all of these stats. Having a critical mass of women at the table means that different issues are discussed. But I would add to that there is often a different sensibility, there's a different way of interacting, and there's a different commitment to substance. Because my experience of the majority of women who I have come across who've been involved in politics got involved because they were really concerned about an issue, they wanted to advance a cause, or they felt that there was a need for a leveling of the playing field or a justice reset. And so that changes the discussion when that's why you're in politics.
So two possible takeaways: leveling the playing field, but also we got to come back to setting the table, because you've given away the secret that you set the table to trap the male politicians, that they couldn't get away without agreeing to you on the inquiry that you were looking for Indigenous women. Interesting. Let's talk about, I'm going to just focus on what you both just raised about energy. And there's a lot of questions coming from the students on gender, which are really important. So it's not that I'm putting that aside, but I think they're coming. So stay tuned. And before we get to those questions, let's pick up on the thread of geographical and provincial interests. I remember watching Christy Clark, who was with Premier Wynne, Christy Clark, former Premier of British Columbia, who was with Premier Wynne in our Ryerson Democracy Forum about a year ago. And there were divergent interests between Alberta and British Columbia, between Premier Notley and Premier Clark. So gender cannot trump everything, obviously. But tell us, perhaps, Ms. Wynne first, about how you tried to triangulate, to try to find a way to leverage the national interest on climate change, which was very important to you and the Premier of Quebec at the time, and Alberta's desire. And we're going to talk about Alberta in depth too. There are some questions coming about, there's a fascination, Premier Notley, about Alberta from your Central Canadian and primarily Central Canadian audience here today. So how did you triangulate on climate change, or putting a price on carbon and getting energy out at a time when there were some people who, in Quebec, for example, who thought, hey, that's not our problem?
So, Martin, let me just start from my belief about problems and issues, which is that it is a useless response to throw up your hands and say, we just can't resolve this. You know, we're too polarized, it's impossible, so we're just going to walk away from it. And I think, I don't know whether it's lived experience or my training in mediation, but you know, when I was working with families or with small organizations who had to stay together, who had to find a way through a problem, there was no walking away from it. And so to suggest that somehow Alberta's got an economic issue because of their resource-based economy, and Ontario doesn't have that exact same issue. We have a more diversified economy. So therefore, we're just not going to talk about it. It made no sense to me. And so what I was trying to do was find a way to say here in Ontario that we have to find a way to embrace the notion of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the things that I said was that Ontario may, in the short term, have to do more. You know, Ontario may have to find a way to reduce our GHGs to a greater extent than another province in order to compensate and then let Alberta catch up. And when Rachel became the premier, it was quite clear that her objective was to balance the resource extraction and transportation with reducing GHGs. So why would that not be a perfect opportunity for the provinces to work together? So I guess that, you know, that was how I saw it, Martin. And we had a problem with Energy East. I mean, there's no question about that. Quebec was not interested in seeing that pipeline, the section built. And so I had to, in Ontario, I had to make it clear that we would do the environmental assessment that needed to be done. So that's the work that I tried to do on that file.
Premier Notley, how did it look from Alberta? You had a tough crowd in some provinces. How did it work with Kathleen Wynne?
Well, I think, with Kathleen, it you know, as you can imagine, we were able to find a lot of common ground. I think, you know, going back to the issue of sort of problem solving and you know, and again, I haven't done all the reading, so whether this is a gendered thing or not, but, you know, you redefine the problem and you also try to redefine the solutions and you keep the door open to different solutions. So, and this sort of adage, I guess, applies not only to this conversation, but for instance, the conversation we're having in Alberta right now at 5,000 decibels is, you know, do you work to protect public health or do you protect the economy? And to me, when you create, as Kathleen rightly puts it, these false dichotomies, you invariably ensure failure on both issues. And in fact, the issue becomes, well, if you, for instance, with the first thing, maybe what you do is you find a different way to support the economy while also ensuring that you're supporting public health. And with the issue of climate and access to tidewater for our oil and gas industry, you know, our view was always that you needed to look at the two together and that we needed to stop putting them at odds with each other, and we needed to find complementary ways to pursue both objectives. I think that you know, I was quite proud actually of the plan that Alberta introduced, our climate leadership plan, our carbon tax even. I mean, I know guys all across the aisle were not fans of that, but at the end of the day, it formed the backbone of what much of the work the federal government is doing now. And lo and behold, at this point, it is probably our best hope of convincing our neighbors to the south to allow us to continue constructing the Keystone pipeline. So the reality is that you sort of reframe the issue, and instead of being, you know, I must win or you must win, and the only way I win is if you lose, and redefining it so that you find a way that to develop, to in fact, you almost, we got to the point where our work to secure pipeline access, particularly with respect to TMX, was inextricably linked to success on greenhouse gas emissions. And I was literally at the point where I was thinking that attacks on our plan to reduce emissions were going to jeopardize the pipeline, ironically. And so, you know, as we slowly developed the programs, not to mention the many economic benefits, other economic benefits that come from investing in greenhouse gas emission reduction. So that's sort of how we did it. And so by being able to take that approach, we were able to keep people at the table with more disparate interests around the table longer and get folks to sign on to what we all agreed were the ultimate objectives.
Once again, we're talking about the table and how you set the table and how you triangulate. And for what it's worth, watching as a journalist, I thought that triangulation was truly a political miracle. So to what extent it was gender or just the two policy wonks, as you both describe yourselves, and the approach to a zero-sum game is another question. Let me just throw one more issue question at both of you, and I'll stick with Premier Notley, and that is something you both have in common besides trying to work out the energy issue, was the idea of a minimum wage targeting $15. And Premier Notley, you just mentioned the balance between COVID-19 health and the economy. That's an old trade-off that people often raised with the minimum wage is, oh, you're going to cost a lot of jobs. That was the old paradigm. More recent economic research actually is showing quite the opposite, that if you look at just empirically at places that raise the minimum wage, that didn't happen. Jobs were not lost. But you're in Alberta, and Premier Wynne also had a bit of a tough sell here in Ontario. Why was that important to you? Why did the two female premiers push the minimum wage? Is that a cluster? Is that a pattern? Or just did you ever compare notes on this? Any thoughts you might have on that?
Well, I do recall at one point we met in Queen's Park and we did compare notes a little bit because I think we had kind of announced it a little bit ahead of Ontario. And then
that's right. Yes, you did.
About sort of the politics that we experienced. And I shared with Kathleen some of the arguments that had worked for us. I was quite proud of Alberta in that it actually remained and remains a winning position amongst the population of Alberta. And although the current government has rolled it back for young people, we've yet to see them, and they've threatened to roll it back with other folks. They haven't moved on that yet. And it may well be that one hopes anyway, that they're seeing the polling. But, the way it happened, honestly, was back when I was running for the leadership of our very small party, one of three leadership candidates to lead our caucus of four in the fall of 2014. It was just one of the policy proposals that I put out in the course of our leadership campaign. And so it was something that was very early on with my positioning. And so then, of course, when I won and then we ran in the campaign in the subsequent spring, we made that a clear element of our campaign to Albertans. And so it worked out well because we've been very clear with Albertans that this is where we were going. And so we were sort of able to move forward. But and like you, I didn't ever see it as an either or I'm not sure what you see, but certainly I was aware of the out there that in fact a $15 an hour minimum wage generated more economic activity by putting money in the pockets of those who are most likely to spend it within their own economy, as well as minimizing the economically draining feature of inequality. So yeah, that was kind of how it rolled for us. I don't know, Kathleen, what would you like to add?
Well,
and before you do, let me just quickly say, you had that target both in common. Jason Kenney and Doug Ford both have in common the idea of trying to roll it back, because Doug Ford froze the minimum wage at $14. It had been scheduled in law to go up to $15, and he rolled that back and imposed roughly a 36-month freeze. People don't realize it, but he also froze it until waiting for 2.5 years. So Ms. Wynne, how did you do it differently?
Yeah, so basically what Doug Ford has done is he's going to take us back to that time like Mike Harris, who froze the minimum wage and we fall behind. So anyway, so I had wanted to raise the minimum wage, Martin, for some time. We were still trying to get the economy back on track. When I became premier in 2013, we were still dealing with about a $10 billion deficit. We had made a commitment. The previous government had made a commitment to balance the budget by 2017-18. So I was trying to deal with that and the economic pressures that we had. Manufacturing sector in Ontario was in trouble and so on. And so at each juncture, at each budget, we would talk about the minimum wage, and there was a lot of pressure on us not to do it because the economy hadn't recovered. But then by the time we got to 2016, 17, 18, the economy had recovered. We were in much, much better shape. And I didn't buy the arguments any longer. So basically, I did what we wanted to do all along. And the fundamental challenge, Martin, was that, and Rachel, I think we had talked about this, if corporations had been increasing their wages to a living wage all along, then we wouldn't have been in the position of government increasing the minimum wage. So when we increased the minimum wage and, Loblaws freaked out because we did that,
They did.
If they had been paying a living wage all along, and that's what I basically said to them, this is not something, this is not an anti-business move. This is about people being able to feed their families. So it was incredibly popular. People still come up to me and say thank you. Even to this day, they will say to me, "You changed my life." And, I wish, the only regret I have is I wish we'd gone to 15. Luckily, we had Alberta to point to. I'm so glad you went first, Rachel. It helped us enormously in Ontario. But I thought that the one sort of soft to business that we made was to put off the increase by a year to $15. Wish I had not done that now, but never mind. So that's how we got there. And as you said, we did not see a decrease in jobs. We saw an increase in jobs.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, there had been so many warnings that we would lose 140,000 jobs, bank economists and Chamber of Commerce. And in fact, the opposite happened. And I loved pointing that out retrospectively after the fact. And I guess as for stopping at 14 or using 14 as a bridge point before hitting 15 a year later, I guess that was you triangulating or negotiating, and it's always hit and miss whether that works out. Let's switch over. Let's mix it up a little bit. We had a couple of issue questions. Here's one. You'll find coming up a couple of questions in Alberta. There's a lot of interest in gender, of course, today, and a lot of interest in geography. So you may find that amusing. Premier Notley, I've lived in Alberta, and so there's always a fascination here with what it's really like over there. But before we come to that, here's a question from Tori Llewellyn. Both of you come from different political backgrounds. How did you come to find where you stood on the political spectrum and your beliefs? And how did you choose the party that you wanted to associate with? So interesting question about how did you decide to be a liberal and not a New Democrat? And how did you decide to be a New Democrat and not a liberal or Tory?
Do you want me to start or?
Sure.
I thought I would let you guys figure out who would go first. Yes.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Well, I mean, obviously, the fact that my father was the leader of the NDP, and I think I was on my first NDP campaign when I was about 3.5, and there's all the family pictures of me being held by Tommy Douglas. Obviously, my family had a lot to do with it.
But it would have been let me just say, it would have been such a long shot. You grew up knowing it was a long shot when Grant Notley was the Premier of Alberta. So you might have had second thoughts about that.
Oh, yes. In fact, yeah, well, it's true. And in fact, but although interesting, I'm being pointed out, you can't see it, but I have this photo on the wall behind me of my dad in the Ledge office with a picture of him in his other office behind it. And then above it is a picture of me in the Premier's office with my dad's photo. Anyway, it's probably too complicated. But no, the other piece, though, that I talk to a lot of people about is that, my mother, obviously a big New Democrat, was originally from the U.S. and her activism was primarily through the church. She was very involved in the liberation theology movement. She was very, very active in the Anglican Church, and she was, although strangely socially conservative on issues around women's rights, which is a whole time that we can all sit together and do group therapy about, very, very progressive on economic and political issues. And so because I grew up in a town that was 6 hours north of Edmonton, where the legislature was, my dad was around, every second weekend or so, and my mom was obviously a big influence. And so I learned so much about human rights and justice issues around the world from her. And so, both my parents were tremendously significant in developing my political opinions, which were pretty well baked by the time I was 17 or 18. And it just became, and then the other piece that sort of moved me into politics, I suppose, was of course being a lawyer and being frustrated by injustices in the law, and at a pretty early age concluding that it's much easier to change the law than win a case, on a case-by-case basis. And so those things together, my sort of I was taught that politics was a noble thing, and I was taught that the best thing in life was to be an activist and to make change for those who weren't being treated fairly. And so those things led me to my political home.
Kathleen, when people will sometimes say that you're a pretend New Democrat in the Liberal Party, and
totally
New Democrats won't.
Totally.
Yeah, New Democrats in Ontario would not agree with that assessment. So why did you end up being? We don't want to get Rachel Notley in trouble here with Andrew Horvath, but why did you end up choosing the Liberal Party?
Oh, it's interesting you say that. I remember meeting Lynn McLeod one day in the women's boardroom on the second floor at the legislature in the washroom. And I was a parent activist at the time. So I was, raising some hell in the gallery or the other. And I was going in and I had just decided that I was going to run for the Liberal nomination. And she said, "I'm really glad you're with us. I'm surprised. I didn't think you would be with us." So there were lots of people in the Liberal Party who thought I was too far left. But the reality was that I am a centrist. I need to say something, though, about the labels, the party names, and geography, because a Liberal in BC is different than a Liberal in Ontario, is different, an NDP is,
Fair enough.
The party ideology is not monolithic across the country. So I think we need to remember that. Grade 8, my teacher at the time in Richmond Hill, I went to McKillop Public School in Richmond Hill, very conservative little town. We had a mock parliament, and there were, 30 conservatives, 4 Liberals, and 1 NDPer. I was one of the 4 Liberals. My family was Liberal. We had always, my parents had always voted Liberal. Although my mom, I think sometimes she voted NDP and just didn't talk about it because she would argue way from the left with my dad. So for me, it was that I was comfortable in the center of the spectrum, Martin. I believe that in Ontario, it meant that I was not tied to either an ideological rooting in the free market and in the corporate well-being, and I was also not tied to organized labor. Although I am a strong supporter of organized labor, I had watched what had happened with Bob Rae. I knew that there were lots of challenges in terms of that beholdenness. And so I felt most comfortable in the center of the spectrum. That's where I tried to say, I called it the activist center, as you know, and I hold to that position.
And I can't let what you just said get away, because it was very perceptive, if I may say so. The bit about ideology depends on geography, and without trying to get either of you in trouble, an Alberta or Saskatchewan New Democrat is different from an Ontario or Nova Scotia New Democrat. And of course, a BC Liberal, Christy Clark, who we had on last year, is very different from an Ontario Liberal. It's much more right-wing in BC. And so there's that geographical fluidity, if I can coin a phrase, but there's also ideological fluidity. Rachel Notley worked for the Attorney General in BC, we've said, Ujjal Dosanjh, I believe, who became a Liberal, and Bob Rae became a Liberal. So there's, people move around in the ideological spectrum as power looms. Okay, so I'm going to cheat a little bit and go to a question not from a student, but from a professor, Professor Tracy Rainey, who welcomed you earlier, because it segues into another question I want to ask. And she points out that no woman premier has ever been reelected to the position in Canada. What do you make of this rather dismal statistic? And do you think that gender explains some of the reason for this? Now, before you answer, I'm going to just say what Rachel Notley's thinking is that, Christy Clark and Kathleen Wynne both agreed to come on this forum as they were exiting from politics. Kathleen Wynne is still serving as an MPP, and we're going to ask her about that later because there's a student question about women politicians who don't cut and run and who stay in the legislature. But she's not running again. Christy Clark was already out of politics. Rachel Notley is running again for Premier of Ontario. So in answer in advance, Alberta. Sorry, thank you. I see I'm not a multitasker like Ms. Notley is. So I'm mixing up my provinces. But Rachel Notley, why don't you answer that question first? Why hasn't a female premier, been reelected? And how are you going to make history again?
Well, yeah, again, it's hard to make global assessments on why that, because first of all, there's such a small group of women that have reached that level. And I think the bigger question is why are so few women getting to that position? In for instance, Kathleen's case, I mean, the reality is she took over a party that had been in government for a long time. So I think, and the same, frankly, was also true with Christy. And I think that's actually the case for almost every female premier, myself and Pauline, and maybe, I know there's one other woman that's an exception to that rule, but the point is, and so the question becomes, why is it that it goes to women at the end of a government's term? Yes. So that's, I think, a critical thing. But that's not obviously what happened in my case. I think, though, that, we were in the reason we didn't win is not related to gender in 2019. It was related to many, many other issues. And I don't know that our inability to hold on to government can be attributed to gender. I will say, I know we just had a poll come out today that has us 7 points ahead of the UCP. And, if there was an election today, we'd be winning it. So, who knows where things will end up a little over 2 years from now. I'd like to get reelected and break that pattern. But even if I did, I don't, again, it's hard to make generalizations. I think the bigger issue is that there are a lot of reasons why women don't get to be premier in the first place. There's internal limitations within our parties around how you become the leader and when you become the leader. And there's still limitations to women being able to participate as elected officials at all. And those, I think, are the bigger barriers that exist to having more women as premiers and having more women be reelected.
Just to clarify, Premier Wynne did win an election, but she wasn't reelected because she won the party leadership and took over power. So, but Premier Notley raises a good point, which a number of female first ministers have raised and others, which is why are women only given the opportunity at the tail end of a dynasty or Kim Campbell when the Tories were headed for almost certain defeat? And isn't the answer, I'm going to just ask a rhetorical question, Kathleen, when you don't have to agree with me, but isn't the answer that the men have cut and run because they don't see a sure thing? And so the women, I'm not flattering you, are braver and willing to take a chance because there are so few opportunities. So when the men are running for cover, this is your chance to move in. And it was no accident that it was a runoff essentially between yourself, Kathleen Wynne, and Sandra Pupatella in the 2013, I think it was, Liberal leadership race, because the strong men had, or not strong, but the most bankable names had decided we're not going to win. We're down. We're destined for certain defeat, and that's how you pulled a rabbit out of a hat. So the opportunity opened. But your thoughts?
So it's a bit of a faint hope, right? And that's definitely what it felt like. It was interesting at the beginning of that leadership in 2013. There were men, backroom men calling me saying, we've got to have a woman. It's the time for a woman, right? And it's like, okay.
How convenient.
Exactly, yeah. But interestingly, one of them said to me, but there should only be one woman, because they knew that Sandra Pupatella, anyway. I agree with Rachel's analysis. I am not a betting person but I've got my money on Rachel to break this pattern because I love that poll today. And I think that the toxic masculinity that we're seeing in not just Alberta, but here, I think it's real. So I think Rachel will be able to break it. And I think it is largely an element of the timing, the prospects of the party. Martin, you know perfectly well, nobody thought that we were going to win an election in 2014. Nope. I mean, the odds.
Let alone a majority government.
Exactly, the odds were completely stacked against us. So I think that that's when women have traditionally gotten into power, and when we have more, that will not be the case. And Rachel, no pressure, but it's all on you.
Okay, quick question, because the clock is ticking, and I'm going to ask for some quick responses from the politicians. And this is a gender question, but it's a generic one. I'm just going to ask it quickly. First to Kathleen Wynne, gender parity in cabinets. You came close. It was a priority for you. Why is that so important? And then on to Rachel Notley.
Because when you have women at the table in the right numbers, I mean, it's 30%, but if you have 50% there, you talk about different issues, you solve different problems in a different way.
Good. Rachel Notley, are you with us? Yeah.
Oh, no, I am. Yeah, no, it was absolutely is a priority. It's, I mean, you obviously you do solve problems in a different way. It's important. It's also an important signal. I think that you need to go above and beyond. You don't wait for those things to happen. You must say, as a point of principle, we're going to make sure that women who make up 50% of the population have 50% of the decision-making power around this table. And then we went on and we took a very aggressive and very public approach to having our agency boards and commissions appointments flipped, so that we saw we came very close to gender parity there on our ABCs. And by doing that, obviously, we were actually appointing far more women than men in order to bring it up. And I just think that's a thing you got to do. If you believe that that's important, then you need to do it.
And Martin, just to add to that, it doesn't just happen. To Rachel's point, we also changed the rules around the ABCs to get everybody at 40%. And it's not enough just to have a target. You actually have to make it happen.
Yeah, and Rachel Notley described herself as a policy wonk, and she threw in the ABCs. That she means agencies, boards, and commissions, for anyone who doesn't know what an ABC is. I'm going to do a trick now for Ms. Notley and combine several questions from the students in the Women in the House program. So I'm going to rattle them off and then ask you for a quick answer. So by the way, you're not the first Albertan we've had in the Ryerson Democracy Forum, so don't feel like we're picking on you. We had Nenshi last month talking about how Donald Trump is changing civil discourse in politics. But here are some questions. One's from Deborah Budhu, and I apologize if my pronunciations are off. Deborah asks, did you ever feel that because of your historical achievements as the first woman and New Democrat to lead the province, and you see why that got in my head, and my apologies to Alison Redford, but everyone thinks of you as the first woman politician, premier, but the first New Democrat to lead the province, that you were held to a higher standard than others before you, or that you were always under a microscopic lens? Another question from Emily Sikova. Do you think that being the leader of a province that has always been led by parties leaning towards the right of the spectrum was challenging due to the fact that you were not only from a left-wing party, but you were also the first woman, again, to lead the province overall? You've got a reputation here as the first woman leader. Martina Arcuri, I am also wondering about your experiences in a more conservative province as an NDP leader. Did you feel that this provided barriers to your leadership, and how did you approach this? One more from Kashfa Chaudhary. As the first New Democrat to lead the province, did you and your party feel that policies usually associated with the NDP had to be altered due to the political history of the province? And one more from Bryn Heath. I think a lot of people in Ontario maybe are shocked when they hear about the NDP winning in Alberta, as it has been so conservative in the past and in the present. What is it that put you over the edge? What are the factors and the reasons that you won? So there's an impression that Alberta is a right-wing place. Is the premise, as Kathleen Wynne would often say, do you question the premise of the question, Or is it conservative and you were the first New Democrat, second woman? How did you do it?
Well, there's a lot of questions embedded in there. So let me go back to the beginning. Were we held to a higher standard? I think, honestly, that if you are on the left or even center left, it's easy to, what you do is you run to hold yourself to a higher standard. And by that, what I mean is, I actually believe fundamentally in the value of people coming together to build something that is greater than the sum of their parts. And that is to be, say, contrasted to some folks who really see that the object of getting into government is to dismantle it. Because government in every form is a restriction on freedom, and therefore even when you fail at doing something in public service, it's kind of a win for you because you are undermining the value of public service and thereby increasing the call to reduce its size and the alleged limitations. So anyway, that being said, then what that means is you run on hope and opportunity and great things that you're going to do and you're going to build. And so you, instead of saying our promise is to walk away and let you do whatever you want, you instead deliver a message saying our promise is to come in and make life better. You essentially raise the bar for yourself when you get elected, I think. And I think that a lot of governments in the center left do that. And there's no question that we did that. And of course, we did it at a time when the economy was facing, up at that point, the single largest recessionary shock it had received since the Depression. So little did we know it was going to only get better. Anywho, in terms of what is Alberta and how conservative is it, I'll say this. There is a strong streak of very, right-wing conservatives. But I would argue that it does not in any way, shape, or form represent the majority of Alberta, and it hasn't for a long time. One of the upsides to having the oil and gas industry here and the amount of wealth that was being created here was that we attracted people from all over the country to move here. And we also attracted a lot of people from out of the country to move here. And so we did and still do actually have the youngest, best educated, most diverse population in the country. And people don't think about, when they think of Alberta, there's this idea of this, grizzled dude on a horse with his cowboy hat riding across.
And lots of pickup trucks.
And lots of pickup trucks. But in fact, we're the most urban province in the country. And we draw people from all over the country and all over the world. And so there's no question that folks who have been running the province for a very, very long time do a good job of trying to tell people what their culture is. But when you actually sort of meet them one-to-one, you realize, oh, wait a minute, that's not actually what you guys think. And that is sort of witnessed by the fact, even after Jason Kenney won the election, as convincingly as he did at the time, we had 20,000 people in front of the legislature when Greta Thunberg was here. So in support, just to be clear, in support. So Alberta is evolving. And it's very multidimensional, and there is much more to it than the idea that is typically portrayed, particularly in other parts of the country that don't have the privilege and the opportunity and the pure joy of coming out here to visit.
Well, that's why I thought I'd have some fun with those trick questions, which I knew would not throw you. But this is, we can turn this into not just a discussion about gender, but geography as well. We're a big country. And I've lived in Alberta and I've lived in Edmonton, which isn't really Alberta, because Alberta is polarized, just like Ontario is. And you can ask Kathleen Wynne, who put in her time as agriculture minister in hope of reaching out to rural Ontario, and it didn't work because it was very polarized on urban and rural lines. And I suspect Alberta is as polarized as any place on the planet right now. So here's a question I want to segue to, because it comes from Alex. I like it because it speaks to both of you. From Alexandra Nash. When a male party leader loses an election, he typically steps down from leadership and often resigns from elected politics altogether, disappears from the legislature or parliament. In contrast, both of you still hold your seats in your respective legislatures. Rachel Notley remains the leader of her party, and as I've pointed out, is going to stay as leader of the party and run to be premier again. Is this just a coincidence, or are women in politics more resilient or more willing to stay in a career that doesn't offer constant linear advancement? I'd like to hear your answers. Before you do answer, though, it is my observation that most other male leaders disappear as soon as, Stephen Harper, Dalton McGuinty, they feel it's somehow undignified to show up when they no longer have the mantle of power. And I see Kathleen Wynne in the legislature holding Doug Ford to account as an MPP, and initially enduring some heckles for that, but still holding him to account, as we did when he came on the Ryerson Democracy Forum last month. So I'm going to ask Kathleen Wynne to answer first, because you were premier and you came right back the next day as an MPP, no longer as party leader, however.
Right. So I felt very strongly that our defeat had been resounding enough that I needed to step down. I also had made a commitment to my family. I'm going to be 69 at the next election. I feel like it will be 22 years I will have been in elected office by the time the election comes around. So I felt
you'd be considered a very young candidate in U.S. presidential elections, of course.
I know. I am aware of that, and I have had people remind me of that when I said I wasn't going to run again. But nevertheless, I decided that it was a good thing for me and good for the party. We were down to a very few seats in the legislature, and it was time for me to step down and let a new leader take over. And in fact, Martin, that there was a lot of chatter the second year into our mandate after 2014 that I should step down then because I was unpopular, and I felt strongly that I was in the middle of my first majority mandate that I had won. There were things I wanted to do, and I was going to be damned if I was going to waste that. I was going to do the things that I needed to do. And quite frankly, if we were going to lose, why would I hand that over to a new leader anyway? So I made that decision.
But to Alexandra's question, once you stepped down as leader, you still showed up for work every day and earned your pay. So was that hard? Was it natural?
So at the beginning, I made that decision. I felt an obligation to my constituents. Was it difficult the first day I walked into the legislature? Absolutely. It was incredibly difficult. And there were lots of people saying to me, it isn't dignified. You shouldn't be there. It doesn't look right. It's not good for the party. It's not good for you. There was a pressure, and there were people who were worried about me. I think people don't want to see other people suffering. They don't want to see the indignity or the pain of someone being subjected to a humiliating situation. And so I had to be very clear with people that I was there because I chose to be, that there was no bad seat in the legislature. And quite frankly, over the last 2 years, Martin, I feel that I have contributed. I have supported my colleagues. I've supported John Fraser when he was the interim leader. And I have done things in the legislature that it wasn't possible for anybody else to do because I had been in those chairs. I had been the leader, I'd been the premier, and I knew the workings of government. And so I was able to stand up and say things that other people have not been able to say. So I feel quite vindicated in staying. You will note that I am not there. I'm not in the legislature every day. I'm working every day, but I'm not in the legislature every day. I think that it's important that I be there to hold the government to account. But I also think it's important that my colleagues have the ability to be there without me as a lightning rod, because I am a lightning rod, and that sometimes gets in the way of other people. So I've tried to balance those things while serving my constituents, and I feel strongly that it was the right thing to do.
But I guess the question is, and I think we're answering it, is that men don't seem to make that decision once they're out. And I can tell you that, without saying who, that a former male premier who was very fond of you asked me once privately, well, for goodness sake, why is she still in the legislature? And I said, I think she believes it's the right thing to do. It's not undignified. Rachel Notley, did you have a decision to make after your loss? And was it tough for you to go back to work?
Well, I think there's a few things. First of all, I don't know that it's always the case that men don't come back. I mean, one of the people that I used to be very inspired by, who made a fundamental, foundational change to the province of BC in a mere 3.5 years, doing things that British Columbians still benefit from to this day, was Dave Barrett. He was in government for 3.5 years, and then he tried to get back in for another 15 afterwards. Now, I'm not promising to try and do that, but you know, I mean, and he was someone that I had a great deal of respect for, and his record was really something. You know, Adrian Dix was never premier, but he was leader of the NDP, and he led it to one of its, you know, rather unfortunate losses. No one thought he should have lost, right? But he's still there, and now we see him every day being the health minister. So I don't know that it's straight across the board. I will say, I think New Democrat premiers are slightly less likely to be offered alternative employment. But no, really, the thing for me is, going back a little bit, I think in terms of women, to see if there, I don't know if there's a gendered lens to put on this, but I will say, you know, I never really bought into the trappings of power when I was premier. I found it, I was a bit uncomfortable with it, and a bit uncomfortable with the deference, and a bit uncomfortable with the pomp and circumstance. And that thing, I think that you are a good leader as long as you remain connected to your roots and your non-political friends and the people in your community who you love and care for, and who, you know, and I think that as long as you do that, then you just kind of stay real. And so this idea of whether it's undignified or not undignified, I think certainly that's sort of what I sense in Kathleen too. You know, she's pretty good at staying real. And so that sort of self-consciousness around that is less likely to drive your decision making, because you know what it's like to be in there and to make decisions and to do good things. And it's not about the how other people see you. It's about the work you do when you're there. The other thing I would say, I mean, honestly, I was first elected in 2008. I became leader of a 4-person caucus in November of 2014. And 5 months later, I was premier and leader of a 55-person caucus. And now I'm leader of a 24-person opposition. I feel like I feel like I'm going back to take the course I skipped in high school, and so I'll be in better shape to actually run again, because and then, you know, for me as well, obviously, you know, I had a lot of people asking me to stay on, and I think what is true amongst women is that you're slightly more inclined when you're in a situation to be sort of guilted in. When people, right. I'm kind of easily guilted into things.
Yeah, that's true.
So anyway, I mean, all of that, again, it's somewhat gendered, but it's also a thing about like what drives you. And I care about my province. We did big things. I feel that the best chance to undo the undoing is to take another run at leading, another run at government. And it's most likely, I figured that I'm probably one of several good options for our party.
I hadn't heard that before. To undo the undoing is an interesting phrase. Sorry, Ms. Wynn, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, Martin, you'll remember Lynn MacLeod came and sat in the legislature and stayed after she was no longer the leader as well. And I always think that you know, your constituents elect you to be their MPP or their MLA. They don't necessarily elect you to that high office. And so there is an obligation there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of my pet peeves, like we all agree, one of my pet peeves is when people quit in the middle and cause by-elections. Here's a question that came in from Suzanne. First of all, thrilled to hear from 2 female leaders in Canada. Thank you. All organizations, including governments, business, not-for-profits, are struggling to be more representative and democratic through a culture of inclusivity and equity. How do you do that given the hierarchy in organizations and the continued prevalence of male leaders? Just a quick answer, because we're running out of time from each of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really takes taking those intentional steps that we talked about earlier. You know, it means asking people who are not necessarily on a list. It means stepping outside the usual suspects to ask for participation. And I don't think there's any other way around that. And I feel that I did some of that. I probably didn't do enough. And I think that it really takes a lot of effort, because there are always people who are on the sort of the inner circle who will show up. And what you have to do is really reach beyond that and be very, very intentional about it. And sometimes structure the organization in such a way that, if we're talking about a party, for example, structure the organization so really the rule is you got to have 50% women, and that's then not questioned.
Yeah, no, and before you go ahead, yes.
Well, I was going to say I agree with Kathleen, and I will say that the idea that because the rules are the same and everybody has an opportunity, that therefore we should just wait for it to happen has been proven now over 3 or 4 decades or 5 or however long now to be it doesn't work. And so what we have to do is we have to go in and change systems, change criteria for what it looks like to be the right candidate for any leadership role, and then seek out people on that representative basis. And I will also say that it's particularly important in politics because left to their own devices, parties, all political parties, will operate in a way that inadvertently leave women behind. And so they must be intentional about including women. So even my party, which is very progressive in terms of pursuing legislative change that would support women, still is a party that operates in a very combative, partisan field. And so we operate still in a way that makes it harder for women to participate fully. And so we can change that to some degree, but the other thing we have to do is just be exceptionally intentional in just pulling women in and making space for them, no matter what, because it won't happen naturally.
Because it's not as easy as it sounds. It's great to say you're for parity and diversity, but I don't know enough about the Alberta NDP, but I know that Andrea Horwath has said publicly that the Ontario NDP was too white and too old. And that changing that is hard. And for Kathleen Wynne, bringing more women into cabinet meant she had to make more room for them, which meant there had to be a gentle squeeze play for some of the older male politicians. And that's not easy if you are by nature a political animal, as you both are, and you're all about winning alliances and having political IOUs, not as sinister as it sounds, but there are loyalties, and suddenly you have to change the playing field, as it were. So that's pretty tough. Okay, I can't.
The patriarchy doesn't go. The patriarchy doesn't step down happily, either in aggregate or as in individual. So
yeah, and the patriarchy, as the token male mediator, moderator here, patriarchy isn't always evil. It's just there and in the way sometimes, right? I mean, I'm thinking of particular decisions you had to make or maneuvers you had to make to achieve gender parity amongst your fellow liberals, and also to take risks in terms of ejecting members from caucus who were accused of sexual improprieties. That's also hard and not as easy as it sounds, especially if you end up losing the seat. So here's a question I cannot allow to escape before we run out of time. We've gone from gender to geography and now sexual orientation. Question from Amneet Bogal. As the first woman and openly LGBTQ+ person in your roles as leader and premier in Ontario, and in the case of Premier Notley, not the first woman, the second woman in Alberta as premier. What, if any, additional pressure did you feel, and how did you handle it? Kathleen Wynne first.
The way I usually answer this question, Martin, is I was never a straight male premier, so I don't know what the extra pressures were, right? My experience was my experience. I know homophobia played a role. Homophobia played a role in every single election that I have run in. There's just no question about that since 1994. Being a woman meant that, I defied the image of, Rachel talked about what leaders look like. People didn't think I looked like a leader. And I have stories about that, walking off an elevator in China and the people who were greeting us Andrew Bevan was my chief of staff, big guy standing beside me. The people knew that I was a woman. They knew the premier was a woman, but as soon as we got off the elevator, they said, Mr. Premier to Andrew, you know? So I just think that those expectations, they didn't surprise me. It's just that you're constantly having to make it clear that you are the decision maker, make it clear that you actually are going to facilitate a decision, you're going to facilitate the meeting, whatever it is, and that not that you're in charge so much, but that you're in the role that people don't expect you to be in. And so I guess that's an extra pressure. But, you know, honestly, Martin, it's something that women deal with a long time before they're premier, right? It's not like all of a sudden you become premier and, oh my goodness, there's misogyny and sexism in the world. Like, we learned that really, really young. So we have our coping mechanisms. We have our way. I have my way of, you know, of being light in a moment. I swear strategically so that people know that I'm not going to be offended if they swear. You know, you use these techniques to put people at ease and demonstrate that even though you're maybe not one of the boys, but you are able to hold your own. And I learned a lot of those a long time ago, and I think I used them often and every day in my role as premier.
Premier Notley, any thoughts about how you dealt with sexism?
Well, you know, I mean, well, first of all, I swear excessively, actually.
Not strategically, but excessively.
Excessively, yeah. But no, I mean, it's interesting. Honestly, I haven't felt it as much as I have in just the last year and a half with the you know, what I would refer to as toxic masculinity that we see demonstrated by the current government. I will say I noticed it somewhat when I was in opposition from 2008 to 2015, much more subtly. To the degree that I was not one of those people that was going out for drinks with my colleagues on the opposite side of the house. And, you know, for the first 4 years of my term, I was, you know, I would go out for drinks with my one caucus colleague, but there was only one caucus colleague. And then for the next 4 years or 3 years.
Did he play golf?
God bless him. No, he didn't, and neither did I. So that was really wonderful for both of us. And then the following term, it was me and 3 male colleagues, and so I would go out for drinks with them. But the point is they would all go have drinks of scotch in the minister's offices with the folks on the other side, and I was not invited into that. So to some degree, you know, I experienced that, but. You know, I didn't really lose sleep over it. And other than that, I will say before I became premier, not only was Alison Redford premier, but the leader of the official opposition who almost became premier was also a woman. And so the notion of being a woman leader in Alberta politics wasn't revolutionary at that point. And so I really honestly didn't feel like I did obviously feel that I had to do things to support women, and we had huge you know, battles to do things to support people in the LGBTQ+ community, particularly in our education system and our introduction of a very I'm very proud of it. It was a very progressive GSA policy or set of laws, but you know, and
I remember just GSA, of course, Gay Straight Alliance, a term that we don't use even today compared to a few years ago. But I do remember when Jim Prentice came to meet Kathleen Wynne, the former premier of Alberta, and Gay Straight Alliances were a big deal in Alberta at the time, as they had been in Ontario 2 years earlier. A reminder, whether it's on Gay Straight Alliances, gays in schools, or women in politics, or LGBTQ+ in politics, the timing is everything. And it's just so interesting to hear you point out that, yes, the Wild Rose Party leader was already a woman. There had already been a PC leader who was a woman. So the stars were not quite in alignment, but they had shifted by the time it was your turn.
Yeah. I mean, the one difference in their case was both of them, frankly, in different ways, were pushed out by their primarily male caucus colleagues. Whereas my well,
that never happens in the NDP.
They won't let me go. It's quite irritating.
But Tom Mulcair, however, when he visited Alberta, was not quite as lucky as you were. So it's not an Alberta protection thing. Okay, let me do another trick question for both of you, which is I'm going to combine 3 questions to get 3 student names in here and get some quick answers before we run out of time. So Karen Kamal says, are there core values that young women should possess before considering political leadership? Tori Llewellyn again, do you have any advice for young women looking to get into politics either in the back rooms or as elected officials? So advice for surviving the back rooms as opposed to the front rooms. And Sarah Dunnett, what were some of the things that you did that you felt, other than hanging out with Ed Broadbent and Tommy Douglas, that you felt best prepared you for politics?
Okay, well, I'll try and start really quickly. Listen, I mean, if you wanted me to turn this into a candidate recruitment opportunity and or staff recruitment opportunity, I would tell you that you need to have my values and then move here. So, but I won't do that. What I will say is, I'll just tell my own experience. I mean, have the courage of your convictions is the first thing. Know that it can be hard to speak up, but it ultimately is worthwhile to do it. I'll just tell this story, I guess, is the best thing, and then maybe people can go off of that. You know, listening to me go on all this time, you would probably be surprised to know that I almost failed out of my honors undergrad poli-sci degree because in my honors forum, I was so scared to speak in public. I never contributed to the debate, the conversation amongst the 12 of us who were honor students because I was so intimidated to speak in public. And what helped me, well, first of all, was that I was told I would almost fail if I didn't start talking, although it didn't really help then. I just felt more nervous. But nonetheless, what helped me was knowing that my dad, actually, who was widely considered to be a great orator, was actually brutally shy and just practiced and until he got to the point that he sounded like he did it naturally. And so if you believe in something enough, even if you're super nervous and you practice, you would be amazed how you can change your own personal assessment of what you're able to do. So, you know, over the course of 4 or 5 years, I got to the point where I now actually enjoy speaking in public and engaging with people. And, but that certainly wasn't where I was. And, you know, if you believe in it and you're nervous and you've got your cards and you're talking, and this is in the back room as well as in front of a mic, this is in any setting, you know, believe in your voice and push through it. And eventually it will come as a form of, as something that's comfortable for you.
Oh, really interesting. Kathleen Wynne.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the learned skill. So Rachel's talking about a learned skill. What I was going to say is that you need to care about something. You know, you need to be involved. I always say this to young people when they ask me about getting involved in politics. It's not about getting involved with the political party. It's about deciding what it is you care about and getting to understand that thing and be involved in it. And if politics is it, or if politics is the forum that you want to be in, even that, you need to bring something into it. You know, what is it from your life experience? For me, it was publicly funded education. You know, I really cared about education. And when Mike Harris was elected in Ontario and started undermining it, it really made me worried about the future of the province. And that's why I got involved at the provincial level. So I think understanding an issue, caring about it, coming into the political realm, whether as a candidate or as someone in the back room, I think that puts you in a really good position because then you have something to contribute. And I've seen 14-year-old kids get involved in the political parties, and they come in because they're interested in a thing, you know, because the actual activity itself, interesting as it is not going to be enough to carry you through the tough times. You really have to care about something. Last point I will make, to go back to the learned skill piece, for me, it wasn't public speaking. I've always loved public speaking. For me, it was anger management. And so in 1990, I got involved. I trained as a mediator because I knew that I needed to find a way to channel my anger, to deal with my anger about all sorts of things. And that training, and then my work for a decade in conflict resolution and as a community mediator, has helped me enormously in my life, but also in politics. I remember the director of the Toronto Board of Education, when I was first elected as a trustee, saying to one of my colleagues, "She's so angry," you know, and you know, there are a lot of things to be angry about, and I was angry about a lot of things, but I think I have learned over the years to be patient. I have learned to channel that anger into action, and it was a learned skill. It took a lot of practice, it took a lot of training, and it has stood me in good stead. So I think there is an element of knowing yourself well enough to know where your gaps are, where the weaknesses are, and to work on those, because we can learn to be different in a lot of ways if we try.
Although if I can just jump in there, one small thing. I mean, that all is wonderful. I will note that it is not an uncommon thing for men to denigrate women by chastising them for being angry. And sometimes it's that anger that is necessary to push you out of your comfort zone into the place that is uncomfortable for you, but where you need to be in order to make the change. And so don't ever let somebody's judgment about your anger, especially a man's, stop you from taking action.
I completely agree, but I wanted to be able to control it, Rachel. I wanted to make sure that it didn't control me, so that my mom used to watch me when I would first go on interviews, and she'd say, "Kathy, you were too hot, too hot. You've got to just calm down." So I think as long as you can control it, but anger is a really important thing, and it's really important to acknowledge it. Like so many things, too much of it can be a problem.
Yeah, or as Bill Davis would say, in all things moderation. Actually, his mother said that to him all the time, and he always quoted his mother, who gave him good advice. And I think what Kathleen Wynne was trying to say is that you said controlling, but really you were modulating, and the word you used was channeling it, because passion's part of it. What's interesting about your responses is that the questions were quite interesting. They weren't, don't shoot the messenger or the male moderator here, but it's the questions were not about the structural challenges, about which there are plenty, and you have enlightened us about them. It was about some of the internal challenges as well. And so to hear from two premiers about how you overcame your own personal hesitancy, in addition to the systemic barriers that awaited you. It's two pieces to that puzzle, it sounds like. I want to just close, because we're running out of time for questions, mine and from the public, and we have to liberate both of these two leaders to get back to work. But I want to close with a letter, an open letter that was published last year by the female First Ministers of Canada, that I think resonates today and for the audience, and in particular as a segue from the questions we just had from these Ryerson students. And the appeal is this, and I think your two signatures were on this, so I speak for you here. Quote, "To women who think they just aren't ready, we say to you that entering politics was one of the best things we ever did. Put your name on a ballot and give it a go. You will create a future full of second chances. Until we achieve the full and equal participation of women in politics, we will not reach our full potential as a nation. Generations of Canadians before us have pushed for the inclusion of women in politics." That's all the time we have. I'm going to hand it back to Peggy Nash from the Women in the House program, Peggy being a female politician in her own right, pioneer. Thank you briefly before the formal thanks comes, I'm going to sneak in my thank you. Thank you, Rachel Notley. Thank you, Kathleen Wynne. And a special thank you to Kathleen Wynne for coming back a second and third time. Over to Peggy Nash. Are you there?
I am definitely here. What a wonderful, wonderful discussion. I know people probably have other things to get on to, but I just want to say to former Premier Wynne and former and hopefully future Premier Notley, you're the best examples of why we need women at the table, and not just at the table, but heading up the table and calling the shots. So but inclusively, of course. So thank you so much for your frankness and your open discussion this afternoon. We really appreciate you taking the time. You're still two very active, busy politicians, and we appreciate you carving out this time for us. And Martin, as always, you're such a skilled moderator. You have managed to foster a very frank and interesting discussion. We really appreciate you flagging questions from a number of the Women in the House students. It really helps with our course about getting more women involved in politics. And I just want to thank all of the participants for being here today. I know we didn't get to all of your questions, but we really thank you for taking part in this Ryerson event. So that's it, everyone. Thank you so much and have a good afternoon and evening.
Thanks, Peggy. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.